All right, welcome back, guys. So in this video, we're now gonna kind of move things along, and we're gonna now start talking about we're gonna start talking more about how entertainment works, or how basically the theory of entertainment, right? So we basically have to talk about two different principles. So we're gonna go over one in this video, then one in the next video, and then we'll kind of set things up to. We're gonna talk about basically how things entertain you and how they affect your subconscious mind. Basically, how they quantize your subconscious, right? And basically, we're just going to reiterate the same principles we really have been talking about. Excuse me. We're going to talk about the same principles we've been talking about, but we're now going to talk about it more in the cases that are based on what you're observing, right? Not necessarily just what you're imagining in your mind, which is really what we were talking about before. So in this video, we're going to talk about the importance of attention, right? So what you're paying attention to. So just to go over this first point, it says where your attention goes, energy flows, right? So you've probably heard that a million times. I've heard it for the first time, I think only a couple of years ago. Anthony Joshua, so he's a boxer, he said it in some video. And I was like, I like that, right? But I've never heard it before that. But it's true, right? So if you're talking about subconscious energy, then that's actually true, right? That's exactly how it works, right? So what I like to do, basically set things up, I like to give very precise, clear-cut definitions, right? So that when I'm understanding these things in terms of theory, I like to know what logically follows from some basic premise or some definition, right? So I like my definitions to be very precise, very clear-cut, not left to sort of interpretation or whatever. So for me, I feel the need, and I do this multiple times throughout the book, I feel the need to clearly define what attention means. Now, we use the term every day, all the time, but what does it actually mean? Well, for me, it just refers to whatever your mind is focused on in the moment. So I kind of like to think of it as like, your mind almost has like its own eye, in a way, right? So the term we would use for it, what it's paying, I was going to say attention, but the term we would use for what it's looking at, in a sense, your mind's eye, is focus, right? So whatever you're focused on. Like I could focus on things that I'm visually seeing in the room, but then I could also kind of tune it out and just think about something in my own imagination, right? So you would say my focus is more on my imagination than the rest of the room. So in other words, my attention is more on what's going on in my mind. I can also close my eyes and then put even more of my attention in my mind. So your attention is, if you think of your mind as having an eye, you can just say that your attention refers to whatever your mind's eye is focused on in the moment. That's it. So now to set things up, we're basically going to go over this principle. So I call it the attention principle. Now this is a very well-known idea in psychology, and you've probably heard this 100 times too, but we're going to talk about it a little differently for this theory, right? So we're going to talk about it in terms of subconscious energy mechanics. So, basically, just to put this idea more in the everyday terms you've probably heard, people will tell you, right, if you try to think about something, right, if you try to stop thinking about something, you find that you think about it more, or that you really just can't do it, right? Why that is actually something we're going to talk a little more about, because we're actually still going to talk about that in subconscious terms in chapter 12. There's actually a kind of Boolean quality to it. So if you're not familiar with Boolean, that's just, Boolean is the term in computer science. No, I think it's the term in logic theory too. So Boolean is like, it's basically how you connect two statements in what it determines what's true. When you connect those two statements, like you can have an and or XOR. We learned that in the school. That was like a digital logic gates and things like that. But anyway, you can also have a not statement, which is like negating the truth of some statement. But anyway, that's not important. I don't know why I'm going into that. But anyway, your subconscious almost has a Boolean-like quality to it. So this gets into the Boolean, which we're going to talk. I mean, we don't go over multiple statements. We don't need to. We're just going to cover how a not statement works in subconscious. You can almost think of it as subconscious energy Boolean. But yeah. Anyway, getting back to this, basically what this principle generally means is that, like I said, the more you think about, if you try not to think about something, you can't help but think about it. Now, For our discussion, we're going to put this in slightly more subconscious terms, right? So what I say here is you can't think about something without drawing at least some of your attention toward the subject of that thought/intention. So that's a very, I don't know if that makes super lot of sense the way I wrote it, but what I'm trying to say, and I call it the attention principle, what I'm trying to say is basically if we go back to the structure. So remember what I said, for your conscious mind, for this theoretical framework, we're going to presume that we're going to describe every thought by the conscious mind has an intention, right? So every thought the conscious mind has is an intention or intending something, right? Now, an intention has a structure. So it has the subject, it has the command component. The command component expresses itself in 3 different ways, and every intention generally has all 3 expressions included within it. Now, the subject part, however, we describe that as the main point of focus, right? So that's actually very similar to the way attention was defined, but attention didn't refer to any subject. It's just whatever has your mind's eye in the moment. But intention refers to a point of focus that some command from the conscious mind is directed toward, right? So they're very similar, what a subject is and intention is, but they're not the same. But you could say that every subject, right, requires some of your attention, right? Because if it's a main point of focus for the command component of the attention, well, that's not possible to do without having some of your attention focused on that subject. So that's basically what I'm getting at. You can't think a thought or produce an intention about something without some of your attention being on the subject that's part of that intention. And again, every intention must have a subject. So that's basically the axiom, right, that we're using in that sort of proof, if you want to call it that, right? So if every intention must necessarily have a subject, then some of your attention must be on that subject in order to produce an intention about it. Now, this becomes important when we combine it with this, because then we get these things. But this next point it's important too. It's not exactly a derivation of that, but I'm going to combine them. So the next point is that the conscious and subconscious minds, or conscious and subconscious thought, is perpetual, right? So what does that mean? Well, basically, it just means that you can't, for any amount of time, actually turn off or stop yourself from thinking, right? So you can't stop the conscious mind from thinking or producing intention, and you can't stop the subconscious mind from thinking, right? We'll describe what those thoughts are in chapter 8, in the next chapter, but we'll go over a little bit more about how those work. But you can't you can't stop thinking with either mind for any amount of time, right? You can't do it for a second, you can't do it for a microsecond, you can't do it for a picosecond or whatever. Now, to be fair, theoretically, there may be some quantum element of time that you can't go below, right? And that's something that's been suggested in physics, and there's really no way to test for it with such short instances of time. But for our purposes, we're just going to assume it's continuous, right? So you can't stop thinking for any amount of time. You have to think, right? That's how it works. Now, some people may say, well, no, if I meditate, right, I could sort of make my mind blank and basically make it so I'm not thinking anything. I would say no, because I would say that the act of thinking something that seems like nothing, right, is not the same thing as not thinking. You're just thinking nothing, right? You're not thinking, right? So there's a difference between the two. That's how I look at it, right? But you have to think. You can't turn your mind off somehow and make it so you're not thinking. I think it's part of the eternal nature of our spirit or conscious and subconscious minds, right? That you just cannot turn off their thinking for any amount of time. So why is that important, right? Who cares, right? Well, if you combine this principle with this principle, then you get this principle, right? So what is this one? This one says the subconscious must charge based on what the conscious mind observes. Now, the reason for that is because whatever the conscious mind is observing, right, it has the conscious mind is giving its attention toward that thing. Now, the conscious mind can't turn itself off, so it has to think something, right? It always has to think. And every thought, which contains a subject or main point of focus, always requires some of its attention. So if we kind of combine these three things, we could basically say, and I think I should also say, I think maybe it's not a hard proof, because I don't think what I kind of indicated was that, I guess I didn't make it clear. From here, you might say, well, no, because even though something has my attention, maybe I'm not, it's not a main point of focus, right? So even though it has some of my attention, I'm not necessarily producing an intention about it. The way I worded it here is basically saying, if I produce an intention, yes, it must be about something that had some of my attention. But the converse might not be true. Something that has my attention might not necessarily be something that I'm producing an intention about. So I didn't say that here. That actually is kind of incorporated into this second principle. But before I get there, just know the converse is also true. So if something has your attention, then yes, you are going to be producing, your intention is going to be influenced by that as well, right? Whatever the subject is or some point of focus, some of your attention, no matter what it is, right? No matter what you're focused on, some of it has to be incorporated into the intention. Is basically what I'm trying to say. So what it all basically means is that anything you're observing, right, is causing you to produce a thought that's quantizing your subconscious, right? So if I'm listening to music, right, unless I'm just totally tuning out the music and focusing on something else, just like I don't even notice it, right, it's going to impact my subconscious. Because let's say I'm listening to music, now I'm noticing, right, I'm totally focused on the music, so my attention is on the music, right? I can't help, according to this principle, I can't help but to think something that's based on the music I'm listening to. Now that thought is immediately quantizing my subconscious mind. So now it's going to charge in some way based on what I'm observing. So, which is what it says here. We'll talk more about charging in the next chapter. But this principle is very, very, very important, right? Because when you're learning to charge your subconscious, right, once you just pay attention to your subconscious mind, right? So I actually think it's kind of like a form of health, right? You should know what's going on with your subconscious. It's healthy to do that, right? If you don't understand your subconscious mind, you don't understand why it does what it does, you're going to make a lot of bad decisions, right? And you're going to be perplexed by your feelings and why you feel certain ways and why you can't tap deeper into your potential, things like that. Actually, I have a term for it. It's called subconscious dissonance, which we talk about that in chapter 12. But anyway, so yeah, like I was saying, your subconscious will always charge, right? Because it's quantized, right? When you're charging the subconscious, the properties of how your subconscious behaves and what mental abilities you'll gain will be determined by the frequency your subconscious is on, right? Every transcendental mental ability has a frequency. And so if you're observing something, let's say you're listening to music or you're watching a certain TV show, right? The very act of observing it is causing you to produce a thought, right? Which actually that's a little bit what we're going to talk about in the next video. I kind of already said it. But anyway, actually, do I even need to make another video? It's kind of easier to explain this on camera than it is writing it. Yeah, I might not even need to make them. Anyway, like I was saying, so let's say you're listening to music or watching TV, right? You're going to produce an intention based on the music, right? Based on the TV or what's going on in TV. It's going to quantize your subconscious. And if your subconscious stays on that frequency based on what you're observing, it's going to charge, right? And we haven't talked about charging it. We'll go over that in the next chapter. But presuming that it's going to charge one way or the other, based on what you're observing, if it stays on a certain frequency because of what you're observing, it's going to charge at that frequency. So things that entertain you can be useful for charging your subconscious in a certain way. Now, the second point here is also important, which we kind of already gave that away too. But the important thing to know about your attention is that your attention is a finite quantity that can be divided up but will always equal a fixed amount. So your attention is kind of like, it's almost like a vector quantity, right? So in physics, right, vectors, and you probably heard this a million times, but vectors have vectors have magnitude and have direction, right? So your attention is almost like a vector quality in that it has a magnitude and it has a direction in the sense of in the sense it points to something you're currently focused on, and it can point to many different things. But more specifically, I don't know what mathematical object would be good for describing its more complete version. Probably something in topology or algebraic topology. But anyway, I don't really know topology that well. It's like Hom-Topy theory. But anyway, your attention basically has a finite quality, so you can either put it all in one thing or you can divide it between 100 different things. But in the end, you're always going to have the same fixed amount of attention no matter what you do, right? So let's say your attention is worth 100 whatevers, right? I don't know what units to use. Let's just say 100 points of attention. I can split my attention up and focus on 100 different things at once. But if I do that, then each one's going to have at least at most one point of attention. Is it at least or most? Because in theory, you can give, let's say that, okay, let me redo this, right? Let's say that I split my attention up to 100 different things, right? And each thing has at least 1 point of attention, right? Let me put it that way. And it can't go lower than 1 point. Then everything must necessarily have only 1 unit of attention focused on it. But if you add them all up, it's still 100 points or units of attention. On the other hand, I can focus on one thing, give it all 100 units of attention, but then absolutely nothing else is going to have any of my attention on it, and I can't produce an attention based on any of those other things, right? So now, why is this principle important? Well, this is important for this last thing here, which I think I was able to fit in on camera. So the more attention you give towards some subject, the stronger the subconscious response to that intention is. So what that means, and you'll learn about this later when we start charging, when we start talking about charging, right? But the more, when you're charging your subconscious, like I said, we started to talk more about context or stories or circumstances where there are multiple subjects and multiple relationships, right? So when you start to work with bigger situations like that, you can give more of your attention to some subjects or more of it to other subjects, or less of it to some and less of it to some other subjects or relationships. And what you're going to notice is that the more of your attention you give towards something, the stronger your subconscious response. So it's going to charge faster, right? And the compulsion is going to be stronger. Now, you're going to learn why this is important later, because it actually is, you're going to learn how to charge your subconscious even better when you learn how to give something your full attention. So I call it a state of full attention. We talk about that in chapter 12. And you're going to learn how to really get a good charge out of your subconscious. I used to not know how to do that because it is a little tricky to do. It's not as simple as just focusing on something, using your negative mind. Because you have a fixed amount of attention from your negative mind, but that's not the kind you're going to be using to charge your subconscious, because that's just your subconscious in its ground state. You have to learn how to give something your full attention in a way that's going to impact you when you go into transcendental state. So we haven't really talked about that yet. Again, that's in the next chapter. I should say when your subconscious is in an excited state, right? Well, we talk about transcendental states in chapter 8. But anyway, for now, just know that the more attention you give towards something, the more powerfully your subconscious charges. So when let's say you're in a performance, right? Let's say you're like me and you want to be a conversationalist, right? So at least that's what I used to practice. I haven't done that in a while, but I used to practice that a lot, right, with my subconscious. So what I would need to do is I would need to try to put all of my attention into the activity. We're kind of going over some of the stuff in chapter 13, but I would put all my attention into the activity of conversation, just all of it, right? And what would end up happening, I would have a much stronger or more powerful subconscious response, or my subconscious would charge faster. It would charge the creativity component faster, so I can get in the zone quicker, right? The fixed level of attention of your negative mind, you know what I mean? That's not really going to do much, right? It works differently when you're just going by your negative mind. So, it's kind of a little hard to go over why this is important right now. But just remember these principles, right? Maybe I don't know what it's like to learn this stuff for the first time. I feel like I keep saying that, but this was the order I thought made sense. to explain it in, to talk about this principle now. But this is, like I said, I haven't known this principle for years, right? I didn't learn it anywhere near the order that I'm explaining it, so I don't know what it's like to learn this from the first time in the order that I'm teaching it to you guys. But anyway, just remember this principle is very important. So just to recap a little bit, you can't think something, you can't produce it in an intention without some of your attention being on some particular subject. You can't turn your mind off, right? You have to think. Your subconscious is always going to charge as a result based on what you're observing, whether you like it, whether you want it to or not, right? And attention has a finite quality. You can either put it all in one thing and get a really powerful subconscious charge, or you can split it between many things, and your subconscious will charge relative to each thing, but your charge is going to be much weaker. There's really no point in doing that. So you pretty much always want to have your subconscious, most of your focus on one thing. This is something I kind of learned to do almost to a fault, because once I understood this principle, it's like in my life, whenever I use my subconscious for everything, right? So I'm always charging for one goal or another. But I always know, like, man, if I have like 2 or 3 different goals that I kind of got to juggle at once, I'm like, man, I know I'm not going to be able to charge my subconscious to perform any one like magnificently or like really well. So I hate being in that situation because I'm just used to using my subconscious. Like I usually will pick one particular goal and I just start charging my subconscious just for that goal, right? So usually it's in the form of performance or charging. We haven't talked about it yet, but the one I love doing the most is just connecting to God, right? That's the most amazing one, right? That feels just wonderful. So, but the problem with doing that is that also takes attention, right? So if I have more things to do, then it's hard for me to focus on that charge. So I have to pick one. Now, if I just split my attention between focusing on God and focusing on this and focusing on other things, right, then no one is going to be done that well. So I have to pick one. Now, the thing with God, we'll get into this way later when we talk about spirituality. But just to give a little bit of information now, and my beliefs, what I've learned in my relationship with God and with Jesus Christ, is that the work is always the priority over the feeling, right? Because you can always charge your subconscious in a way that makes you feel really, really close to God, and it feels absolutely wonderful, right? But if you do that, then it's going to be harder for you to kind of sometimes go through the work. Sometimes work that God calls you to do is very stressful. It's it's a lot of effort, right? And you're not going to feel like you're having the most amazing time all the time, right? The presence of God doesn't feel like stress, right? It doesn't feel like any of that. But we're not with God all the way right now. So sometimes you have to kind of give up that wonderful feeling of being closer to the presence of God. You have to give that up to do the work that he calls you to do. We'll talk about all these principles later and kind of my thoughts on these. But that's why I do that sometimes. So if it were up to me, right, I would just charge my subconscious to feel closer to God and in his presence all the time. Like I would just do that endlessly. But, because I'm still alive, right, I'm still on earth, I have work to do. Work that I believe he calls me to do, and so I have to give that up a lot of times to focus on the work. But as soon as the work is done, I go right back, right? But anyway, I kind of went off in tangent there, but I'm just saying with this principle, you basically want to, when you start learning how to use your subconscious, if you're like me and you just start using it for everything, right? You're going to get used to this principle. It's going to kind of get annoying because you're going to know your best performance with anything is always going to be when you can give most of your attention to it, day after day. If your attention is divided between different projects and different important things and you try to focus on multiple ones, then your subconscious is not going to charge virtually any of it. And then you do like nothing well, right? So, that's going to be important. In the next video, reflection. Should we talk about the reflection principle? Let me see. Yeah, no, I'll go over this. I'll make another video for this. It probably won't be that long, but I'll go over it because there's a few things in here I kind of want to get at. It's virtually the same thing as what we're going to talk about in entertainment theory, but I'm gonna make another video for what I call the reflection principle. But like I said, we kind of already said it, but I'll just make one anyway. But yes, but thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video.